The idea is, do we apply public health tools to fighting violent extremism? It's clear that the conventional tools that the military, the national security community, local law enforcement use are simply not sufficient. So what can and should the public health community be doing?
Hello, beautiful people. I'm Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, and tonight I'll be sharing an insight regarding how the forces of progress view the dissident right and the nationalist ideas that the dissident right is spreading. I hope to lay bare the way the utopians, the way the new high priests of social engineering look at things, or at least how the vast majority of their tools, how their cat's paws look at things. My aim here is to illuminate the governing metaphor that shapes how progressives see and understand us, the metaphor that shapes their actions, the way they're acting, the way they must act, as a consequence of how they perceive us and how they are thereby constrained in their thought processes, in their assessments of us. Now, before we get started, please do follow this channel, Semiagog, as well as the sister channel, A Safer Space. You can do so here on YouTube, and you can do so on BitChute. There's also Gab, there's Minds, there is Twitter, and for those who wish to support the channel, there is both GoFundMe and Subscribestar. To those who do very kindly support the channel, all of the credit and none of the blame. Now, the first thing that I need to cover is the importance of images. Some proportion of the people watching this have probably never thought about things the way that I do. So straight out of the gate, I'll try to get you oriented. When I say images, I'm talking about the ways in which people have a world of images inside of them. We can think of these images as culturally transmitted. We can think of them as a priori in some sense, whether we're talking about Platonic forms or Jungian archetypes, or we can rule with Aristotle and view them as based on sense impressions, as syntheses of experience. And of course, we can think of them as combinations or arrangements of all these things and more. But however we can construe them, these interior images are very much a part of our lives. We see them expressed in dreams, in hallucinations or religious visions, in fiction and film, in meditation on possible future scenarios, in imaginative exercises of invention, as witnessed in stories, about Tesla, for example, not only building machines in his mind, but even testing them there. We even see them in our fantasies, in our fits of anxiety, imagining what we hope will happen or what we dread happening. So why have I brought this up? Well, because we're going to be talking about how progressives view things. We'll be talking about how people find meaning in what they see, value judgments in the present, here and now in the physical world are always shaped by reference to what people remember or imagine in the interior world of images. Let's take an example image set. Is a refugee child not a child? Is a child not a soft, giggling, defenseless thing that requires protection? Are children not within the domain of women who also protect and are protectors? Who on earth would hurt a child? Have we not seen icons, statues, and paintings of the Madonna with child presented as a sacred normative model, made manifest in precious stones, metals, and pigments? Have we not read about how the abandoned baby Moses was rescued in his basket? Then what then of these refugee children? The refugee children were so often shown day in and day out, as a matter of fact. is how I'm expected to view them, not a further integration of all these impressions I remember and recollect that I've seen in movies, that I've read about in books, or listened to my grandmother talk about. Thus, to whatever extent this is so, it's clear what I must do. I must protect this child and reject those who suggest otherwise. I must reject heartless xenophobia. The images shape my behavior. And that, dear friends, is weaponized pathological altruism 101. Hopefully you're all tracking with me. I'm trying to illustrate how the images that we see before our eyes in the present are charged with meaning based on how we link them to the images behind our eyes, in our minds, our psyches, our memories, our imaginations, even our spirits or souls. But I expect some of you are still trying to work out why any of this matters. Well, it matters because if we know the imaginal context people use to understand what they see, the one they use to determine how they should behave, the one they use to determine what sort of plans they should make and towards what ends, if we know this, we have a kind of map to the prison of their assumptions. We have a way to orient and navigate within their psyche, observing how they see things and thus why they do what they do. It's even possible, at times, to ascertain what they will in future do, at least in general terms, sometimes even before they themselves have realized it. To understand how to engage with an opponent, you have to know what that opponent is likely to do. And more importantly, what they can't resist doing. This enables one to anticipate. And anticipating the opponent's moves allows one to develop strategies then that can be applied then across time. For those of you who don't understand why this last particular point matters, I urge you to meditate upon the fact that we are where we are precisely because others have been able to anticipate our moves to such an extent that we can seldom resist leaping for the moral bait that they dangle. Doing so because we cannot escape a sense that to do otherwise is immoral or even impermissible. This is what I'm talking about when I say you have to know what the opponent is likely to do, or what the opponent cannot resist doing. And again, understanding the images is key to this. Children are foregrounded in refugee propaganda specifically because refusing succor to children is a thing impermissible. Helping them is moral. We can't resist the ethically normalizing force of the multitude of imprinted cultural images that shape our views. And so we're subject, time and again, to manipulation. Manipulation, which is effective in large part because it weaponizes, for example, old cultural images of mercy, of charity, of maternal and paternal love, of the sanctity of all human souls, of the righteous universal imperative, though the latter is expressed today in shallow and insipid expressions like do better. All this by way of illustrating how important it is that we understand the normative context, the implicit assumptions, those things that are known or even felt as images, but almost never consciously articulated because the assumptions are so fundamental, they scarcely ever come fully to consciousness. Our task here is therefore to shine light on things that operate, for the most part, in unconscious darkness. In order to kindle the light we require, I propose to use metaphor as a kind of lamp. Bear with me, what I mean by that will hopefully become clear. And so we can turn now to the new priesthood. In a previous clip, I talked about my view of our current circumstances as arising out of a kind of post-religious religion, a weaponization of deeply rooted religious instinct based on fundamental misunderstandings of secular humanism, of syncretism, and universalism. All these things manifesting as an addle-pated utopian faith in progress. Now, if you haven't watched it, I recommend you take a look at that previous clip. It's entitled The New Religion. I'll try to remember to link to it at the end of this video. And if you want another meta bone to gnaw on, you might consider watching that earlier clip as well as this one, then using the two together as an example of how to work from first order insights to second order ones. But back to our subject, back to how the forces of progress view the dissident right, and back to using metaphor as a light source. In this case, illuminating certain contemporary professional classes, understanding them metaphorically as latter-day utopian priests. I've explained previously how I see all of this social justice agitation as evidence of a new religion. I've explained that I think the proper level of analysis for our current afflictions is the religious level. But what does all that really look like? What are the images? Well, just imagine that we still have a priesthood, but now instead of cassocks or frocks and collars, they wear the white coats of those who know. They are the white-collar professions. Even the word profession comes from a religious context, formerly indicating vows taken upon entering a religious order. It's obviously a word closely related to confession. Priests still have a thing for white collars and Latin, but they've split up into subgroups. The lawyer professionals who speak bad Latin, the doctor professionals who also speak bad Latin, and the doctor subset of shrinks dealing with the health of the psyche, which is, of course, just a repurposed word for soul. Doctor itself is an old word that has, across the centuries that we've used it, variously meant physician, church father, advisor, scholar, learned one, and teacher. But the sacred has been displaced. The world has been flattened, as in Edwin Abbott flattened. Today, those who profess care nothing for ethereal spirits they don't even recognize as existing. They profess nothing but a kind of resigned materialism. Likewise, they have no interest in souls and salvation. The lawyers look after our property and money, while the doctors attend to our physical bodies. The psychiatrists, and even more so the psychologists, I suppose, are concerned merely with how we feel or behave. And yet their universal normative models are defined negatively in the empty space echoing between their pathologies as enshrined in their holy books, books like the latest edition of the sacred DSM-5. And there are, of course, other subgroupings within the reimagined priestly castes of our current day. But it's all the same old Brahmanical bullshit. As I wrote in my poem, The Church of State, the exclusive new temples welcome the moneylenders with financial services, while the undeserving poor must endure wolves taught to read actuarial tables, as certain as death and taxes. Pulpiteers of the old church would struggle to recognize their amnesiac offspring. These gnaw dog Latin in packs and favor white-collar crime, but they've no use for the soul. Thou hast multiplied thy merchants. Quacks and lawyers wait upon our bodies, lands, and chattel, squeezing fruits of the schism, commissioning small armies to help bury their mistakes deep in churchyards and prisons. What's out of sight is out of mind. Economists are favored with high rank, oracular, and supremely Byzantine, singing mythic scarcity in tremulous castrato, scored by exacting patrons. Rid me of this troublesome priest. But the might of jealous scribes thrives, disavowed and unseen, laying eggs in moist darkness, swarming behind cabinets, boards and bureaus, bar and bench, in mortal fear of the light, quick to sting with venomous pen. I mentioned a number of these latter-day Brahmins in my poem, but for now we can leave the lawyers, bankers, economists, and other secular priests, clerics become clerks, off to one side. We can focus instead on the doctors and the public health people, for these are at the center of the flattened post-religious religion that apes the behaviors of those who minister to the people. These doctors and public health people, them that wear the white coats, they attend our births and deaths. They hear our confessions regarding unhealthy behavior and chide us for our excesses. They counsel on how to improve our relationships. They prescribe penitential lifestyle changes. When we're sad, they give us drugs to make us happy. They pat us on the head when we've behaved well. They admonish us when we've been naughty. They can even work with the state to assert absolute control over our physical persons if it's deemed necessary for our own good. The new global church, this universal church of many one, is predicated on the leveling, worldwide shared concern, the lowest common denominator, which is for one's own ass, one's physical body, and by extension one's property and possessions. Trapped within this perspective of soulless universal materialism, our religious instincts have to manifest within the narrowly limited range of existing forms our mass culture currently affords us. Isn't sickness almost always seen as judgment? As a kind of negative divine judgment? We fear sickness. We seek to ward it off with apotropaic lifestyle changes, which resonate for us half-consciously as a kind of sacrifice made to avert the wrath of God. There's that sense of relief when your doctor comes back with test results saying you're not seriously ill. And there's the terror that one day this won't be the case, that one day the priest will return bearing the most dire omens. The parallels between all of this and priestly taking of auspices are clear. The physician interpreting symptoms or awaiting test results operates within much the same archetypal framework as priests interpreting the flights of birds, examining the livers or entrails of sacrificed animals, or reading the cracks that form on ox bones or turtle shells that have been thrown into the fire. Our doctors, our learned ones, our wise teachers, assume the timeless functions of those who convey our questions and fears to the gods on our behalf, those who carry back the divine replies to the lay people, their flocks. And just like the priests of yore, they expect to be paid handsomely for doing so. Now, I hasten to add that I'm not saying physicians are simply superstitious witch doctors, though sometimes they are, to whatever extent they're not just painting by numbers. But that level of consideration is unimportant for our purposes. I don't care whether modern medicine has value. Of course it does. That's not the point. My focus here is on our religious instincts and how, when deprived of traditional frameworks of expression, they nevertheless manage to exert real influence on our culture and on our behavior, one way or another, whether we are conscious of it or not. And there's one particular area where this unconscious acting out of our old religious modes of behavior appears to hold true most strongly. In my view, our new priesthood really achieves its exaltation in the domain of public health, the arena of human affairs best suited for a flattened, unconscious religiosity to find expression. where grand utopian social engineering projects and foamy-mouthed millennialism are always in fashion, where the metaphor of it all, where the unconscious allegory of it all comes into the most harmonious alignment with the harebrained affairs of men. Rule by theocratic decree. For the public good, we have to stay healthy no matter what the cost. While the priests of old were willing to burn your physical body in order to save your immortal soul, those of today are willing to throw your rights and privileges onto the pyre in order to save your physical body, or so the thinking goes. But don't worry, you can take comfort in the certain knowledge that if they end up having to do that, it'll hurt them as much as it hurts you. And so, having established the metaphor of the burgeoning global public health establishment as the nascent New World Church, and its functionaries as priests and priestlings brought down to date, we can turn the knob to raise the wick in our lantern, yielding the light we need to more clearly see that which confronts us. Thus far, we've covered the importance of images, and we've introduced the governing priestly metaphor. Now we know something of the context. Now we have a kind of light we can use to reveal things that otherwise might be concealed in darkness. So what now becomes visible? What now can we see as regards how the forces of progress view the dissident right? In the old days, they would have viewed us as heretics, as minim, or zindiks promulgating forbidden views. And so they would have used the old models of censorship, the index prohibitorum, or burying you in the ground up to your neck and throwing rocks at you until you stop screaming. And indeed, there still is that dimension to their response. But that's what's easy to see. That's what all of us already recognize as happening. Most of us have already witnessed and spoken out against the censorship, the smearing, the vilification, the deplatforming, the loss of work and livelihood, the prosecutions, and all the rest. And yet we're still arguably missing much of what is really happening. We're failing to take into account, I think anyway, the new governing metaphor, the public health priesthood. The language they speak, with all its many implicit justifications for the actions they take, has nothing to do with heresy, God's word, the devil's misleading temptations, or saving immortal souls. It doesn't even have much to do with the old Enlightenment concerns for individual rights or freedom of expression, for all that these things will be invoked to justify destroying these very things. So, how do they actually think? What view of the world actually does motivate them? One way to determine that is to look at movies, wherein the spirit of the age finds expression in fiction and fantasy. A favorite of mine is 28 Days Later, wherein a virus, known as the rage virus, spreads from primitive, artificially infected monkeys to humans, turning them into shrieking, mindless killers. Mindless killers known as the infected. And this, my friends, has far more to do with how the priests of public health view the dissident right than just about anything else. Listen to the words that our social betters use to describe anything socially objectionable. We hear about epidemics of hate, mass shooting epidemics. One of the most favored adjectives is virulent. We've all seen and heard how often the word racist is paired with virulent. It's commonplace, as is all the talk about how hate spreads like an infection. The examples of this language are endless. They're endless because they reflect the way of seeing the world I just now spent so much time trying to explain. As I said, my view is that the proper level of analysis for our current circumstances is the religious level. And if there's a religion, however half-consciously expressed, it inevitably comes with the emergence of a priesthood. And as an institution, that priesthood will be anchored in a particular gestalt, a particular worldview with its own normative dogma and doctrine. Seeing this for what it is, in a timeless sense, allows us to cut directly through the distracting Baroque details of how it manifests in our present day, allowing us in turn to grasp with certainty its most fundamental characteristics, and more useful still, not only how it will socially articulate, but how it must socially articulate. Look at all of this against the background of COVID-19 response. Coronavirus hysteria is just another example of the governing metaphor we've identified. The true Brahmins, the doctor priests, insist that for our own good, as they've conclusively determined it, we must not worship our false gods, gods which predate their post-religious revelations, based on their decrees issued from the high seats of public health. We cannot be permitted to gather in churches, though of course pot dispensaries and liquor stores remain open. And do we not see them also shutting down our gatherings in virtual space? The racist, xenophobic, bigoted, misogynistic, transphobic, and virulently nationalist associations that they object to, just as we see them shutting us down in physical space with COVID-19, all for our own good, all to keep the infection from spreading. Do we not see such things? Examples of this sort can be endlessly multiplied, and with relatively little effort, because the way I've framed the issues here correctly corresponds to our actual state of affairs. The light of our metaphorical lamp consistently reveals true things because it's based upon an accurate identification of what's actually going on. So let's turn to more specific illustrations of how the new priesthood operates, now that we've firmly established how they think and how they view the dissident right. Let's take a look at the plans they've made to deal with us. Let's look at the steps they've explicitly laid out to combat the spread of our infection, the propagation of our impermissible heresies and virulent wrongthink. We've already seen that the wearers of the sacred white coats of authority talk about forbidden ideas the same way they talk about infectious disease. If I am right, as I most certainly am, we should expect to see a clear correspondence between how the new priesthood deals with infectious disease epidemics and how they deal with the potential spread of, say, nationalist ideas. We'll now turn to a World Health Organization framework for managing epidemics. As we all know, the World Health Organization is a globalist, utopian organization, more or less congruent with what might be called socialism or communism. And it's a part of the UN, a powerful force behind the various anti-white projects we've been watching unfold for quite some time. Anyway, the WHO clearly sets forth their process for dealing with epidemics. First is the anticipation of new and re-emerging diseases to facilitate faster detection and response, followed by early detection of emergence in animal and human populations. The third stage is the containment of the disease at the early stages of transmission, followed by control and mitigation of the epidemic during its amplification. And fifth, the elimination of the risk of outbreak or full eradication of the infectious disease. We can see all these stages elaborated in the illustration here. Of course, the actions of those who wear the white coats will take many different forms. Certain actions will fall into certain categories, and these categories of action are laid out sequentially. But recognize that these 5 or 6 domains don't have to run in a particular order. In fact, they'll almost always be running concurrently. So far, so good. But now we should ask whether we see this same approach reflected in how they deal with the dissident right. The answer is, of course we do. We've seen that the forces of progress use organizations like Hope Not Hate, the ADL, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and many others to anticipate where impermissible thought might emerge. They've also put considerable effort into early detection of impermissible thought. Just try saying something you're not allowed to say on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. Automated systems can pick it up almost instantly, which brings us to containment. Once the offending ideas have been detected, the various social networks are directed to shut it down. Most of us have personally seen scores, if not hundreds, of voices that have been shut down temporarily, and many others that have been shut down permanently. If channel strikes and Twitter timeouts don't work, they just erase you from the platform entirely. Can't allow infections to spread. And if the infection does spread, if the thoughts continue to be expressed, they just scale up their operations to approach it as control and mitigation, which is pretty much where we are now. But never lose sight of the fact that the end goal is explicitly the elimination, the eradication of the impermissible ideas. If you find that disturbing, take comfort, as I said, in the certain knowledge that it's for your own good. Most of the people doing this to you certainly do. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you their strategy. Their strategy to deal with the dissident right is becoming explicitly ever more a public health strategy. This mode of thinking informs and shapes every aspect of what they do to silence you. Still don't believe me? Here's a study done some time back, which I suspect has quite a bit to do with why my own channel has been algorithmically throttled, given that I myself was identified as an alt-light radicalization pathway, leading people to think in unacceptable ways, which is just another way of saying that I'm a vector for the transmission of sickness. While it's titled Auditing Radicalization Pathways on YouTube, don't let the sophomoric academic speak fool you. The metaphor is fundamentally medical, as we see in the liberal use in this paper of the term infection. Now, if that's not enough, let's have a look at misinfodemics. Misinfodemics? What the fuck ever. It's a barbaric word. Misinfodemics. And priestly public health thinking on how these epidemics of misinformation contribute to the spread of disease. The following comes from an article published in The Atlantic in 2018. Now we know that disease also spreads when people cluster in digital spaces. We know that memes, whether about cute animals or health-related misinformation, spread like viruses, mutating, shifting, and adapting rapidly until one idea finds an optimal form and spreads quickly. What we have yet to develop are effective ways to identify, test, and vaccinate against these misinfo memes. One of the great challenges ahead is identifying a mimetic theory of disease that takes into account how digital virality and its surprising, unexpected spread can in turn have real-world public health effects. Until that happens, we should expect more misinfodemics that endanger outbreaks of measles, Ebola, and tooth decay, where public health practitioners must simultaneously battle the spread of disease and the spread of misinformation. As I said, examples of this kind are all over the place. If you doubt me, take some time to look into it yourself. But rather than offer up more instances, I'll turn now to how we might use this better understanding of where they're coming from, of how they think, of how they're overwhelmingly likely to act based on that thinking. First off, we should be crystal clear about the fact that if we know what metaphor governs their thinking, but they themselves are not fully conscious of it, of its origins, of its associated images, or its repressed religiosity, then we have a potential advantage. We know how their interior images are arranged. We know that they operate based on a suppressed religious instinct that they, for the most part, fail to properly identify as such. And so we're in possession of a much more expanded and informed context for their behavior than they themselves are. That puts us in a similar situation to those who've previously exploited our own unconscious behavioral contexts. Remember my earlier mention of how refugees are presented as helpless children in need of our love? Remember how people who know how we think, how our internal images articulate, can use that knowledge to their advantage? Well, perhaps now is the time to return the favor. And there are many ways to do this. One is to use the old Alinsky method of holding people to their own standards. Remember his famous line about making the enemy live up to its own book of rules? From this perspective, you could have a look at how they talk about stigmatization. They like to go on about how important it is not to stigmatize illness, how stigmatization complicates infectious disease management. And yet when it comes to silencing voices on the dissident right, they're clearly using public health strategies to combat the ideas they find offensive, to combat ideas they find disgraceful, ideas that they see as evidence of moral failing and turpitude. Yet in all of this, we see them manifestly applying public health frameworks based upon stigmatizing, specifically stigmatizing, actively stigmatizing those they seek to silence. You could drive a truck full of migrants through the inconsistencies in their thinking and behavior. I've even seen a number of books out there with titles like How Stigma Subverts Public Health. One can't help but wonder if sources of that sort might be mined for rhetorical weapons. Certainly seems likely. Along similar lines, we could look at the fact that virus is an old word. In its roots, the word simply means poison. When they call people virulent racists, they're calling the person poisonous. I can't imagine that sort of dehumanizing language is acceptable. What? It certainly isn't acceptable to refer to the Chinese in such a hateful fashion. I'm not virus. Perhaps it's time to cast some hot white light on the hypocrisy inherent in referring to unacceptable thought as virulent. After all, if a person is virulent, if they're supposedly like a virus, wouldn't it then be acceptable to sterilize them so that they can't propagate? Doesn't that call to mind imagery that's, uncomfortable? But merely answering the question as they themselves have framed it is only one possible approach. There's also the approach of establishing less reactive, better planned strategy and tactics by way of response. As I said before, grasping the metaphor that governs their behavior allows you to anticipate their actions. If you know what path they're going to take, if you know what path they have to take, you can be there in advance, waiting for them above the defile, well rested with stacked piles of rocks, ready to drop on their heads in leisurely fashion, so to speak. Now, I've only just begun to scratch the surface here. Hopefully more people familiar with dialectics and rhetorical manipulation will come forward to carry this thinking further, to find new opportunities to apply it. People like Jason Kona of No White Guilt and Horace the Avenger, who has a deep interest in memetics, these people certainly know the value of plotting one's way through this sort of background and context, because it's the unavoidable preliminary exercise if you want to identify the weaknesses inherent in how our opponents attempt to frame us, how they try to shape the way we're seen by insisting upon talking about us in certain ways, while forbidding any discussion of us in any other terms. In closing, I will say this. We're all already well aware of the smears and the shaming, the deplatforming, and all the rest. We're familiar with these features of the struggle to make our voices heard. These are the things we already know about. But we have to extend our awareness and understanding. In addition to all of this, we should also be taking into account the more methodical, measured, long-term, putatively scientific approach that's being taken against us. We should open our eyes to the fact that the new priesthood, those who wear the white coats of knowledge and authority, have been employing social distancing as a strategy to isolate us for decades. We should be alert to the fact that their goal is explicitly to anticipate our appearance, to detect our activities early, to contain our expressed thoughts, feelings, and ideas, to control and mitigate our ability so much as to speak with others. And ultimately, once they've flattened our curve, their aim is to eliminate the risk that we'll ever speak again by effectively eradicating our impermissible thoughts and the burgeoning epidemic of our poisonously virulent ideas. Get it? Got it? Good. Semiagog,